John Feehan is the Regional Practice Lead for Open Sky Professional Services and is responsible for business development and consulting services for the South Central region. Previously, John has worked in pharmaceuticals, consumer products, oil and gas, telecom, healthcare in positions ranging from developer to consultant to director. Before that, he was a captain in the U.S. Army. John will be talking with us today about the evolving DMZ architecture. Please join me in welcoming to the stage John Feehan.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it. I've worked in professional services for about 20 years, and this information comes from an engagement this past year where an enterprise client who had a kind of a piecemeal network, many different data centers brought together through acquisition, recognized that it didn't have a common architecture and it had to kind of get a little more serious about the security of its enterprise. And so they started and asked for some assistance in creating an architecture of the DMZ. They had competing approaches and they wanted to get some ideas from outside and other people's experience on what that might look like. Now, when working in this, what I found interesting was not many people had seen, there are many more designs than there are architectures, and people hadn't really seen too many DMZ architectures. So they'd seen security standards, they'd seen firewall designs and certain things, but not an architecture. So that made it quite a bit more interesting. So in going into this, I learned that the DMZ, which has been around for quite a while in the IT network, back 20 years ago from my CCIE days, that it's in some ways has changed. And it was pretty interesting. I thought I'd kind of take us through some of that. I would really welcome any sort of questions or comments as we go along. This is just kind of one snapshot of one engagement and some discussions with some pretty smart. So what I learned is some things had evolved. And I'm going to just touch on the history of the DMZ as a structure has been around quite a while and really highlight the principles which are kind of unique to the architecture versus the standards and the design. I'm going to look at some of the features that have stayed the same over the years and others that have progressed and a couple that are new and really moving things along. So the term DMZ is really not that old. It only dates back to the beginning of the 20th century. But the concept, the structure itself, has a long, long history. So in medieval towns, they had a wall around a marketplace. At the town gate, controlled access. The marketplace itself reduced risk as transactions were managed and closely watched. And the more sensitive items, goods, money, was in the keep, and that was off limits. Today, in our physical world, the bank lobby has that similar structure. It has a building around its lobby where a guard at the door can control access. The lobby is has a more limited risk for transaction of money, and the goods are kept safe behind the cage in a safe. Similar structure. So within an IT infrastructure, we see, again, the same structure. A firewall on the outside. We have DMZ segments in which we can manage the risk of risky transactions or transactions with risky parties. And it's protected, our inside network is protected again by a firewall and is off limits to those transactions of those parties. So in the architecture, we started really articulating, and architecture in our mind is something that has a little more shelf life. It is the principles to which you implement, and trying to create an architecture that is still viable and valuable over years. Designs change a little quickly, and more specific items like security standards may actually change even faster than that. They work together. So the principles we identified for an enterprise DMZ is all traffic is exposed and examined. Access is granted only as needed. Security incidents are minimized, compromises more contained, and recovery more swift. And that compliance with audit requirements is effective. So these are what the values that the DMZ delivers to the computing enterprise. So if we start by looking at DMZ networking, this is kind of where I come from, so I might go a little overboard in this. On the upper right, I put a little speedometer. So that's in the middle of gauge. A lot of it is it's been around, it's very established, it does reasonably well. Some of it has evolved some. So we found in the architecture, and defined in the architecture, that the use of multiple DMZ segments are important to contain breaches and speed recovery. That the primary financially, the revenue generating business applications be kept apart from either riskier interactions or less important interactions like partner connections. That these DMZs by segment you could speed recovery if you really don't have to get a change window, even an emergency change window, for everything in use in your DMZ. Also, a newer technology with the VLANs, the layer 2 segments, now have the ability to expand and cover great distances. It's not uncommon to see for VLANs to actually appear and subnets appear at multiple data centers. It's a mechanism used for high availability. We'd advise significant caution when it comes to extending your VLANing address space across data centers. You could extend a DMZ segment through routing, which is a bit better, so you really want to be careful and consider all your failure scenarios, because extending the DMZ is not foolproof. You can get into some very undesirable situations where your application at the end of the day is still not available based on a particular failure. DNS is very important, and as Monty spoke to earlier, it's an enormous vulnerability. So current DNS architectures have it split. An internal DNS is for servicing internal users only. External DNS is over-provisioned, servicing only externally required DNS services, and they do not overlap. It's fully split. DNS services also within the DMZ are a subset and dedicated. And also other network services should be static and limited to the DMZ. That the DMZ tenants and transactions shouldn't have to make calls into the internal network for services. So in the management of the VLAN, operational support has to balance with security. It's common practice, and pretty sound practice, to have a management VLAN. All management protocols and administrative access must stay on the management VLAN. All transactions with external parties have to stay off of the management VLAN in the other segment VLANs. It is very sound practice, not broadly implemented yet, to use jump boxes, and those that are not fully hardened, but it is a great place to really secure things. It also makes audit support quite a bit easier. So a hardened jump box actually is a smart location to have very powerful, otherwise known as very dangerous, administrative tools, so that all the administrators go through there, use two-factor authentication and secured logging that no administrator can disable. And the management systems that are receiving SNMP traffic, net flow collectors, must be protected from the DMZ. Everything's static and nothing can write inwards to the internal network. So partner connections are a long-standing presence. I think we realize now over the last couple of years what a tremendous risk they introduce into the network. Every enterprise that I've ever worked with has a large number of partner connections, from facilities to copiers to systems to HVAC systems to everything. And basically things are delivered, the partner says, well, I need to get in to manage it. The person who can explain what they need to do and how they need to go in and what they need to use happens not to be there. Push comes to shove and they're just kind of tunneled on directly to its primary box upon which it manages throughout your enterprise. It really represents a tremendous risk, something that we all have probably inherited. So it's important to isolate these connections, consider putting that partner management box in the DMZ, or requiring the partner to really explain what sort of protocols and what traffic he'll be using, and to isolate it on a different segment than the business applications. It doesn't really deserve a bypass. That's easier said than done. Bypass meaning that you have an open IP address into a box inside your network and all ports are wide open and there's no other restriction. And your partner connections really should be reassessed every single year. Are they legacy? Are they still needed? Are they still used? Is that a trusted partner? So one thing that looks like partner connections but is pretty new are cloud connections. Sort of resembles connections to DR sites, in the old days, but again, it has a unique feature that it does require at times very large scale file transfer, which sort of defeats the capabilities of most proxy servers or IDS. It's not always as viable. It's recommended that the cloud entity have its own media store. So all your image backups and your ability to restore it is in that facility. Because in an emergency situation, you won't have the ability, it'd be very disruptive to have to push out a fresh image. So you want to be able to restore your systems, ideally from the cloud, and that large file transfer when you push your images out really should be on demand. It should not be an open tunnel all the time. And authentication, should be integrated, but subordinate. So you're maybe a read-only domain controller. So it's a one-way authentication, and it's limited. Not all of your credentials are out there. But otherwise, it does connect somewhat like a partner connection. So another element of the DMZ is hosting. It's a common, well-established practice not to have durable data within the DMZ. It is really a place to host and examine transactions. So your data goes through, but nothing gets stored of value in the DMZ. Because it is vulnerable there and it works, you want to be able to easily restore. So you don't want any sort of database or valuable cache that you'd have to overwrite if there's a compromise or any suggestion of compromise. Remote access we see evolving reasonably rapidly to a virtual desktop infrastructure. And we've already seen, as you've seen, clientless VPN. Thank God. And firewall rules can be distributed and portable. So challenges that remain in virtualization. Here is an illustration of security to the shared supervisor. This was a particular topic that my client wanted to explain because the architecture was meant to be a mechanism of enforcement, a required standard that they wanted to move to. It also needed to accomplish some education and explain for any sort of adherence to a particular standard. It needs to be understood and a certain amount of belief in the standard. So the whole concept of the security of the shared supervisor, of course, is when you abstract the physical hardware. What you're doing, you're presenting to the virtual guest machines its hardware, its address space for RAM, CPU, hard drive, and it has to be enforced. That VM can't be allowed to write outside that address space and reach another, elsewhere on the physical hard drive and perhaps write to another VM's hard drive space. Those mechanisms are largely proprietary. We haven't heard of that being able to be breached, but it's definitely an interesting feature, especially now that we're starting to see physical applications that run on the physical host, like antivirus that's designed for virtual environments, that actually does have the ability to write to multiple VM hard drives. Now, we're told that this can only happen through the APIs made available by the hypervisor manufacturer, so it's secure. But it's definitely an area because it's a competing interest there, the efficiency versus the security of the VM isolation. Virtualization, we also see a great potential for management capabilities, but don't see a lot of it being tapped yet. There's a lot of talk about automation, but we see a lot of virtual environments still just, watching, IOs and memory capacity, utilizations, etc. And there's still a strong addiction to the command line interface. So I'm just won't give that up. It can very much help with understanding the application flows, as instead of going from box to box to box, you're starting to get much more visibility of the entire flow as it goes across, and that's a pretty valuable understanding. So as virtualization continues beyond the host, you're starting to see networks be virtualized, starting with network services. So this is in another vendor's parlance of virtualization, where you can take and build an architecture like shown on the left that's logically represented, where you have the internet gateway, you have a web server, and between the web server, the application server, database server, you have proper firewalling. The servers here are in pink and the switching is in green and the firewall controls in blue. All the while, in reality, they physically may appear like on the right, where a single chassis you can carve out virtual context for each of those functions and interconnect them in a way to achieve the isolation you see on the left. Now, this virtual context, again, is not just, there are a couple of major vendors who are really introducing this now. So most of our clients we see are smartly. Host virtualization is very well embedded. There's a continual move to virtualize appliances and services, and then it'll make sense to go switch out and you continue to virtualize the network. And in some of those ensuing management capabilities, once you have more and more virtualized, it can actually represent dynamically the path of an entire flow or entire session. So that offers tremendous viability. And we try to calm the different technology silos within IT, because we're getting to the point where they're starting to have to share the glass. The networking guys are managing a network that happens to be viewed by compute's screen over there, because part of the network is now within the virtual server as well as physically in front of them. So they've got to rethink how their organizations will work together. And it's important to continue to invest in the understanding. The easier things get, the less they are often understood. And when it comes to troubleshooting, you don't get too far if you really don't understand the mechanisms, the transactions, and the automation that are really happening. So, briefly, the technology continues to evolve, but the principles remain, and the principles are what live in the architecture. And we think these are pretty sound because it's important if you're trying to implement an architecture is really design first and to what you want to have done, even if you can't meet all these points, because it is very easy to have your objectives be overwritten by vendor capabilities or presentations of what could happen. So we feel the sound DMZ architecture remain that all traffic is exposed and examined. It's a simple statement, but you'll fight that to your dying death, unfortunately. Access is only granted as needed. That doesn't mean it's difficult or you're hostile, but only as needed and justified. And security incidents can be minimized and compromised more contained. The DMZ is a place where you expect incidents. If they happen, you want them to happen there. And so you've got to plan as if they will happen and then walk through recovery, make recovery easier and faster, which is basically use multiple segments. The things that used to hamstring people to implement more segments, which is primarily capacity, expensive switch ports, with virtualization has really reduced. You can allocate resources across DMZ segments so much more easily now. So you can build an easily recoverable DMZ segment. And then compliance with audit requirements is effective. No matter how regulated you are today, next year you will be more regulated and the audit will be more onerous. So you just got to understand that you need to have this data to provide and plan that ahead of time so it doesn't cause nightmares. That's what I had. Yes, Lonnie. Oh yeah, that was kind of a touchy point.
Virtual switching, virtual hosting multiple DMZs on the same physical server to include both virtualized and casting copies, as well as the storage. Do you advocate shared resources across these DMZs?
There's a hierarchy of needs there. So the first stance we kind of took with taking at risk being dated, and his question was, what's the position on shared resources? Is that a physical host does not host DMZ segments and internal resources. That we recommended that the physical boundary between the DMZ internal remain. Now, that may seem old-fashioned in a few years, the way things are going, and small companies probably can't afford that. But we think it is reasonable that different DMZ segments could be shared on a physical host. The capacity and efficiency you can achieve with a physical host with proper uplinks and NIC cards, just can't be matched. You'll be boxed in by the physical separation very, very quickly because your segments won't obey the sizing that you want, right? Nothing ever does. And so we feel that you can share on a physical host different DMZ segments depending on your need. It's sort of a operational capacity, security balance depending on what you're isolating. Everything in the DMZ is at risk, otherwise it wouldn't be in the DMZ. So it's a lot riskier than internal. Then you look at what's in the DMZ and how much does that vary? Is it vary a lot? Network resources and sharing network resources. Well, not your DNS server, for one. Usually, I think network services kind of make a segment just for network services within the DMZ that supply the DMZ. VLAN segments? Yeah, just no automation. You know, like routing protocols out to the internet, BGP should really only be run if it's really necessary, not just because it's kind of cool. But, you know, authenticated peering, the external firewall, router should be really ratcheted down. No VTP or any sort of dynamic VLAN trunking, which is a trunking protocol for VLANs. It's a different approach. You don't want a lot of automation, frankly, in your DMZ. You want it in your internal network, good automation. But OSPF, good. VTP can be happy. We're all happy with that. You don't want it in the DMZ though.
So now you're saying you were recommending split file and split DNS in your implementation. Are you seeing any issues with virtual firewall? Obviously, with multiple virtual hosts sometimes.
The virtual firewalls first. I think the tie of a firewall to a physical thing is kind of exploding. So if you look at firewall rules, group policy, which are almost the same thing, applied at a different spot, you have to think of your firewall rules and where you're placing them, and whether they're controlling network access or application capability or client reachability. They're serving different purposes, and they should be distributed based on what makes sense. So you'll see firewall rules applied to your hosts that your host can't change, to the client VDI pool, as well as your ingress from the internet to the and your ingress to the internal network. So yeah, you have to look closely at performance in firewalls still. Not all firewalls, but there's no inherent weakness in the virtual firewall. And there's some other part too. DNS? Well, and the DNS, just internal DNS, resolves to a reliable host outside. It does not resolve to the external DNS service that we have out, or the DNS service in the DMZ. They're isolated that way. Because your DNS poisoning is really, really powerful, really vulnerable, and external DNS has to be external, has to be public. And we're recommending you oversize that so you have some resistance against denial of service. Actual NIST has really pretty strong set of specific recommendations in DNS in particular. Its security standards that it's come out with a couple over the last couple of years are very, very strong. Now, some are just government educational publications, but I can strongly recommend that for DNS. It's very good. And your reliable external sources to do recursive lookups, as Monty referred to, you don't want to just leave that to chance or your ISP. You want to choose. Not all are created equal. Any other thoughts or questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.